We are live. Hey everyone, welcome back to Tom's Hardware. I'm Jared Walton, and of course today is the big day for Nvidia. The day when they get all the fanfare and excitement and happiness and joy, and nobody at all is pissed about them charging $1,200 for a card that, in name at least, replaces the $700 RTX 3080. Yeah. So, we're here today with the RTX 4080 Founders Edition. The card is virtually identical to the 4090 on the outside. Inside, it's a completely different story. Inside, you've got a different GPU, 8103 instead of 8102. You've got less memory. You have a different PCB, but all of the parts have been made compatible so that you can use the same cooler that they use on the 4090 with the 4080 Founders Edition. Which is great, actually, in some cases, because, I mean, seriously, this cooler's a beast. It's a monster. And not everyone wants a huge card, but it did keep the 4080 very cool. It did fine with the 4090 as well. Like, there's almost no reason to look at the other 4090 cards, assuming that you could find the 4090 in stock for the suggested $1,600. And that's the problem. The RTX 4080, Nvidia is looking at the 4090 going, hey, everyone's buying it. It's sold out at $1,600, and now we're seeing them sell for $2,000, $2,100, sometimes more. I mean, it's kind of ludicrous. I don't know how many people there are that are willing to spend that much money on a graphics card, but I can't imagine it's going to be a huge number of people. I think most of those who wanted a top-tier graphics cards, they already have upgraded to the RTX 4090, or they're trying to. And the 4080 save $400 potentially while losing 30% performance, 25% performance. I mean, it depends on the game, depends on what you're doing, but professionals definitely will want to go for the higher end 4090. So that leaves us with the penultimate GPU, the second fastest graphics card in the world for consumers right now, the RTX 4080. This is my dusty test bed. I mean, I know some people would say, hey, you got to clean out that dust, but it just builds back up. I've got a cat. I've got a dog. They like to shed hair. This is what I tested in. It's a Core i9-12900K with a DDR4 motherboard, and that could prove limiting still. We saw this with the 4090, that below 4K for sure, like, you don't get the performance gains that you might otherwise expect. But at 4K, especially with ray tracing, performance is still pretty good. Let's talk about the cards for a minute. So here's a picture showing the 4090, 4080, and 3090 previous gen card. You can see the dust on the 3090 as well. It has been well used, well loved over the past couple of years. But now, something bigger, something better, something meatier has arrived. And we've got the RTX 4090. 4090, 4080 have a slightly larger fan. I believe it's 105 millimeters instead of 100 millimeters, maybe 95. Anyway, I think it's 5 millimeters bigger, but the inner ring is actually smaller as well, so it does provide a bit more airflow that way. Otherwise, I guess it depends on how you want to look at it. From this angle, it's slightly shorter. It's not as long. I think it's 1 centimeter less in length, but then it's also slightly thicker. So it's a full triple slot card, but it is a few millimeters wider than the previous edition Ampere 3090. And then it's also taller or wider from this image shot by half a centimeter or centimeter. The 4080 does come with a dongle for the 16-pin power. None of these have melted yet. We'll see how long that lasts, right? I've got the dongle here as well. So the 4090 cards have all come with quad 8-pin connectors. The 4080 came with the triple connector. Not much more to say about that. I think it will prove more than sufficient in theory. I mean, in theory, we don't know why the 4090 adapters have been melting. Too much power, maybe, but the 3090 Ti had the same heavy power use, and it wasn't melting for the last 6 months, 12 months. When did it come out? In March? So it hasn't melted in the last 8 months. At least we haven't seen reports of that. So it's kind of weird how the 4090 has had these problems. So either it's like not being plugged in correctly and that's causing the melting, or there's some of the adapters are defective, or some of the plugs are defective, or whatever. Yeah, this is the price, as this is the problem, as Mike points out. The real price of the 4090 FE is $1,590 and $1,200 for the 4080. You know, it establishes the 4090 as the card to buy up for it, but it's more expensive than that. $300, $400 less. I mean, they're definitely trying to make as much money as possible right now. And until AMD comes out, with their announced, I mean, I guess I did the deep dive into their architecture and other stuff yesterday. That is coming December 13th. Maybe it will be like Nvidia, and maybe they'll launch it the day before. Not launch, but let reviews go live the day before. I don't have a card yet, so I can say that. They haven't put me under embargo. You know, the 4080 actually goes on sale tomorrow, but we get to put the reviews up for the Founders Edition only today. And then partner cards, we can review them starting tomorrow. Let me just say, I'm beat. Like, writing up all the AMD architecture and card and stuff this weekend, and then finishing the testing of the 4080. I got to bed at about 2:30, woke up at about 8 after the article was already live, and that's why the live stream is going on at 2:30 my time. But thanks for joining us. And yeah, this is a problem, and this is why we've got a $1,200 launch price. I feel is that when you can't find a 4090 for less than $2,000, you know, it suggests to Nvidia that they shouldn't charge less money. You know, if Nvidia had charged $1,200 for the 4090 at launch, it would still be selling at $2,100, because scalpers and the market and the retailers would all push their prices up and say, yeah, people are willing to pay it. So they'll go as high as they can legitimately get away with. And, you know, that's where we are. You're welcome. You're welcome for joining us. If you've got questions, fire them off. I'm going to get through. I've got a lot of graphs and benchmarks. Let's go ahead and get through the pictures of the card quickly. There's not too much more to say. It's got that swoopy curve on the shroud or on the casing that the 4090 introduced. Otherwise, you know, industrial styling aesthetics are nearly identical to the previous generation cards, just with improved cooling. And I will say, cooling is definitely improved. I don't know if it's just the cooler, though. Micron's newer revisions of their GDDR6X memory definitely don't run as hot. Everyone has figured out how to cool them better, but I think it's that the 16 gigabit, the 2 gigabyte chips that are used in these cards, as well as the 3090 Ti and in some other cards as well, but I don't think they run nearly as hot. And to that end, so the 4080, well, I'll get to the PCB in a minute. Oh, go away, alarm. My kids are coming home from school soon. Just going to flip through there, the lovely 16-pin adapter. And as I've noted before, like the extra 4 cents pins, they don't carry power, but they do require more force to insert. And I wonder if that's partly to blame for the melting adapters. The same triple display port 1.4a and HDMI 2.1. The DisplayPort thing is still, like, I'm not sure how to feel about it yet. for me, it hasn't mattered that it's only DisplayPort 1.4. For pretty much 99.999% of people out there, they don't have DisplayPort 2.0, 2.1 monitors yet. They're coming. But those monitors should also support display stream compression. And while the theory behind DSC sounds kind of like 422 chroma sampling, it's not. Like it uses a constant bit rate, generally speaking. It can do variable bit rate, but from what I understand, talking with some people, it doesn't actually get used. So the source, the graphics card, has to talk to the sink, the display, and say, hey, what can you support? Queries, and pretty much none of the sinks support variable bitrate encoding, and so they go with constant bitrate. And the goal is to make a high performance, high quality, but fast encoder. So where, AVC or HEVC can get these huge compression ratios of like 300-to-1 on video, DSC goes for like a 2-to-1 compression ratio or 3-to-1 compression ratio if you're using 24-bit color. I think you can't use there's a bunch of things that come into play, and it's got entropy encoding, and it has to work out what it needs to do. In some cases, the compression actually ends up as lossless. I should talk about that later. But DSC, from what I understand, looks better than 422 chroma subsampling, a lot better, depending on who you ask. And so the net result is you can do 4K at 240 hertz on DisplayPort 1.4a. So does that really matter that you don't have DisplayPort 2.1? I'm still not sure. We'll see how the market develops in the coming months. AMD wins for having the higher spec and the higher bandwidth on their DisplayPort, but it might not be a victory that really matters that much. Okay, I'm looking over in chat. I don't see any questions for me just yet, so I'm going to keep going on. Not too much to say about the rest of the card. Weight, 2132 grams. I believe the 4090 is 2169 grams. It's a little bit more because it's got 2 extra memory chips and it's got a larger GPU chip, but these are relatively small differences. Internally, these are Nvidia's photos. I try not to dismantle my reference cards because I don't want to screw up the cooling. I don't want to change the cooling. Like if I pull it apart and stick on different thermal pads or different heat grease, thermal paste, things might change. So I try to leave them alone. Nvidia provided these shots. They don't have labeled memory chips, but they are Micron chips. I looked at, I think Tech Power Up dismantled their 4090, and if you look at the two and compare them, the PCB looks the same size, but there are differences because of, there's 2 extra memory chips, and there's more of the large inductors, the power phase inductors are used, I think, I can't remember, it was like 2 in the top right corner near the power input on the 4090, and then it had, was it 18 phases that were filled for the GPU and then 4 phases for the memory. And then you look at this and it's like, this is interesting. It's got 10 phases for the GPU, but 6 phases for the memory, maybe? Or maybe some of those phases aren't for the memory, but you can see there's 4 blocks beneath the GPU and two of the inductors above the GPU. Kind of interesting. This does have higher clocked memory. So, from what I understand, Micron only makes 21 gigabit and 24 gigabit per second GDDR6X. And so this memory is clocked at 22.4 gigabits per second, which means Nvidia and its partners are going to have to use the higher speed memory. I overclocked it to 25.4 gigabits per second. It didn't help performance that much, but I did manage to get a 3 gigabit per second overclock out of it. Can we team up and perform a bomb assessment of the board components and cooler? I have the GPU price. I mean, like the GPU price, I did the math. It's 370 something millimeters squared. I've got the 378.6 millimeters squared, and I poked around with the wafer die size estimator, and it comes out and it says, oh, well, you can get like 140 of these per 300 millimeter wafer, which is 50 more than you get of the larger 8102. How much do the wafers cost? Mike, do you know how much the wafers cost? Because TSMC isn't telling me. They won't tell us NVIDIA's contract prices. I've seen guesstimates of anywhere from like just under $10,000 to $20,000. Even at $20,000 though, you know, if you get 150 of them per wafer, it's not that expensive. It's $133 for the GPU. Packaging, wire bonding, all that other stuff costs money. All those inductors cost money. The RAM costs money. I don't know what they actually pay, but I would expect that the total board and components and everything cost is under $400, $500. It's probably about $100 more on the 4090. So cooler is probably fairly expensive, but you know, maybe $75 to $100 is what I would think. Back of the board, not a whole lot to look at. I mean, you do have a lot of little devices on here. And then we got the cooler itself. And that about does it for the teardown. Block diagram. This is the official block diagram for the RTX 4080. And you can see it's got 7 GPC clusters, the graphics processing clusters. Most of those have 12 streaming multiprocessors, except if you look at the bottom line, you've got 2 that have 5 and 1 that has 4. And then you've got a big chunk of L2 cache in the middle, the 8 memory controllers around the outside. Do I have that right? Yeah, 8. I was trying to think. 8 times 64 bits. That's too much, isn't it? So I guess it's 8 times 32-bit. But look at this. This is the full 8103 chip. So I'm going to go back and forth between these a bit. But if you look, the main change is that the bottom 2 GPCs get an extra 2 streaming multiprocessors enabled. But also look at the top. 2 NV ink blocks, 4 NV deck blocks, decoder blocks. But only 1 decoder block is enabled on the 4080. So like professional workspaces, maybe cloud streaming and such, they've got extra decoder blocks in there for the cloud business. So, Mike, I just want a number. Tell me a number. What do you think? Bottom up cost price formula. I don't know. There's lots of stuff out there. I think he means he's emailed me, but I don't know. Okay. Specs. So this is the full specs, and I've got current NVIDIA Ada Lovelace. We've got the top 3, more or less, 30 series, plus AMD's recently revealed Navi 31 RDNA 3 chips on the far right. If you look like shader core counts, you know, there's a big gap between the 4080 and 4090. The 4080 has fewer shaders than the 3090 Ti and even the 3080 Ti, but they're clocked much higher. And so the net result is theoretical compute performance does go up relative to the previous gen. AMD, meanwhile, you know, so NVIDIA is looking at 49 teraflops. AMD's got 52 on the XT and 61 on the XTX with lower prices. Die size, you know, if you look at the 8103, it's 380 millimeters squared roughly. So, you know, probably smaller than Navi 31 when you factor in like the chiplets and all that other stuff. Navi 31, if it hadn't been built with MCDs and GCDs, well, a GCD and up to 6 MCDs, it probably, as a monolithic chip, would have been in the 420 millimeter squared range. So, you know, it is bigger than a 4080 and thus likely should outperform it. I do have like FP16 performance. I'm not 100% certain on AMD's FP16. In the parentheses, I put int 8 performance on the AMD cards. I believe that's correct. That's their AI. They're basically tensor cores, but AMD doesn't call them tensor cores. But I'm not sure if I've got the number right or if it's half of what I put in there. Okay. So, oh, we're on to performance already. Do we want to go to performance yet? Questions. Do I think they cut too many cores for a $500 difference from the 4090? I mean, compared to the previous generation, it's a big difference in potential performance. So like, look at the previous generation. You've got the 3080 with 80 SMs and the 30, did I say 30? The 3090 had 82 SMs. So it's close enough to 80. The 3080 had 68 SMs. They both used the GA102 core. They were relatively close on, like, you had 2 extra memory channels. Well, 64-bit extra memory width on the 3090. And then, of course, they were double-sized. Well, there were 2 GDDR6X chips per... they call it pancake mode, so they put it on both sides of the PCB. So the 3080 Ti only had 12 gigabytes of memory. But like, when you look at the theoretical performance, like the 3080 Ti, which is pretty dang close to the 3090 in performance, is at 34 teraflops compared to 30 teraflops. A 10 something percent difference. I mean, 34 divided by 30, 10.5, I don't know, 12. It's not a huge difference. 83 divided by 49, that's a big gap in theoretical compute. 82.6 divided by 48.7. On paper, the 4090 is up to 70% faster. There are workloads where it is 70% faster as well. So when you say 3090 was $1,500 and the 3080 was basically half that at $700, and now we've got 4090 at $1,600, and the 4080 isn't even close to half that. I mean, it's 3/4 of that. So the price to features ratio has changed radically with RTX 40 series, and I feel like we can blame cryptocurrency again, because the last year and a half, 2 years of shortages made Nvidia and AMD and their partners all think, hey, we can charge more. And they're charging more. Will the price come down? We'll see. So Mike says 486 for 8102, 303 for 8103, and 236 for 8104 was his first pass. Are you saying that's for the chips or for everything in the graphics card? Like, that would be my guesstimate for everything in the graphics card. But you do have to factor in employee costs and R&D. So there is that. Anyway, let's get to performance. I've tested with the 12900K. I would love to have a 13900K. We're working on that. We are going to be CPU limited, so I'm going to mostly focus at 4K testing. RTX 4080. I also have overclocked. Did I talk about overclocking yet? I don't think I did. So 1500 megahertz extra on the memory and 200 megahertz extra on the core clock, and increase the power limit to 110%, which was the maximum allowed. I actually wonder, like, I think someone said, and I haven't verified this, but if you plug a 4090 adapter in with 4 connectors, will it increase the power limit? Someone said if you only plug in 3 of the 4 on a 4090, it's supposed to still work, but it limits how far you can push the power slider. So I'm curious. I haven't tried it yet, and I kind of want to now. But overall performance from overclocking only improved about 7%. That's with I think it's 13% memory overclock and about a 7% GPU core overclock. Clock speeds broke 3 gigahertz in some cases. I was very proud of that. It's the first 3 gigahertz graphics card I've managed to test. So otherwise, 3090 Ti, not that far behind when you get right down to it. I mean, it's what, about 20% faster than the 3090 Ti, roughly. So, and it does become a bigger gap if we use more demanding games, but this is the overall average, and I've got Flight Simulator in there, so that definitely pulls down the average a bit. Okay, let's move on to the individual games. Borderlands 3, maxed out settings, slightly larger gap, I think, between the 4080 and 4090. So, you know, it scales pretty well with performance. So if we're talking overall, the 4080 was 22% slower than the 4090, but in Borderlands, it's 31% slower. Meanwhile, if you look at the 4080 and 3080, I mean, I don't know if that's fair, because whether we like it or not, Nvidia's pretty much saying this is the 3080 Ti replacement. It took the 3080 Ti price. The 3080 $700 card, it's a figment of your imagination. It's not a 4080 Ti. But anyway, it's 51% faster than a 3080 and 38% faster than a 3080 Ti overall. And those, where the 4090 was actually a bigger gap in Borderlands 3, the other two card comparisons, the 3080 and 3080 Ti, they shrink slightly. So kind of interesting how that worked out. Far Cry 6. This one can definitely run into CPU limits on the 4090. And so the difference between the 4090 and the 4080, so many numbers to say, 18% slower, so less than the average, but it's also still 45% faster than the 3080 and 33% faster than the 3080 Ti. And if we, you know, what about the 6950? You know, if you want the AMD comparison, overall the 4080 was 29% faster at 4K. In Far Cry 6, it's 16% faster. So, you know, there are games where it's definitely closer. AMD is claiming up to 50 to 70% performance increases gen over gen with their 7900 XTX versus the 6950. If they hit 50%, they will be faster than a 4090. But I think it's going to be, you know, it will vary by the game. Flight Simulator, like I said, super CPU limited. It's also one of the DLSS 3 games that I tested. So we'll get to that in a moment. But interesting that the overclocked card actually beat the 4090. And some of these results, I disclaimer, like there's only so many hours in a day, in a week. The 3090 Ti, the 30 series cards basically haven't been retested in a few months, and the same goes for the 6000 series AMD stuff. I am hoping to retest everything on a 13900K in the coming months. It will take a while. It's like 2 months of testing to go through every card if I don't do anything else. So, Forza Horizon 5. This is another one that seems to be running into CPU limits. I didn't test DLSS in Flight Simulator, or at least DLSS 2, because it doesn't help, because you're CPU limited. It's also in Forza Horizon 5 now, and right now DLSS didn't do anything, which makes me think that even though I enabled it, it didn't actually work. I tried multiple times. I still couldn't get any change in performance, really. So, and that applied to FSR 2.2 as well. So something is going wonky with Forza Horizon 5 right now, but I assume we will get working upscaling in a future patch. Horizon Zero Dawn, this has DLSS that works. Quality mode, upscaling, improved performance, you know, fairly decent amount. What is that, like 20%? A little bit more than 20%. The 4090 still holding on to a sizable lead. You know, the gap between the 4080 and the 3090 Ti, not huge. Those are kind of the same price now, though. So, I mean, would anyone out there buy a 3090 Ti for over $1,000 if you could buy a 4080 for $1,200? I'm curious. Because I look at it and I'm like, well, I wouldn't recommend a 3090 Ti at $1,000. I think everything should be falling in prices, and it's not, which is frustrating because I'm like, hey, what's the demand that's keeping prices high, or are they just digging in their heels and saying we're not going to reduce prices? People are just going to have to suck it up and pay more money. It feels like the 3080 by this point in time should be selling for $500. Clear it out, sell everything. That hasn't happened. The 3090 should be probably in that like $700, $800 range. 3090 Ti should be under $1,000, but again, it's not happening. Maybe it's all waiting for Black Friday. What is that? Next week we'll get the great Black Friday deals. Let's see. 3090 could be sold $276 to AIB, but the 10Q data for Q2 has gaming gross per unit at $250. So yeah, prices like, and it's no wonder EVGA looked at everything coming and what Nvidia was doing and basically said, we're done. We're not going to deal with it. Because Nvidia can say, hey, the 4090 is a $1,600 card, and they can say the 4080 is a $1,200 card. And then a few months down the road, if they're not selling, Nvidia could drop the price on its Founders Edition like it did with the 3090 Ti. I mean, it dropped from $2,000 to $1,100 at Best Buy. And that forced the AIB partners to react. And I can see where EVGA would be very, very unhappy about that. I'm sure all the partners were unhappy about that. Maybe they managed to sell off most of those cards now. Maybe that's why prices are going up. Maybe there aren't any 3080 and 3090 cards really left to be sold. I thought that was supposed to last until sometime next year, the oversupply, but not entirely sure what's going on there. Red Dead Redemption 2, if you, overclocking has become less useful with graphics cards. There's never a whole lot of headroom. I don't really recommend it. I do the testing, especially on a 4090. Like the adapters are melting. I would not try and push 500 to 600 watts through a 4090 and risk my card that costs $1,600. But I do the testing, and then I run it stock. And this is why. And if you like overclocking, you can still try and do it, but your gains are usually less than 10%, and you potentially risk hardware or at least run hotter. DLSS gives you a bigger gain even when it doesn't provide massive gains. Like Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't a great game for DLSS, and yet it still easily outperforms the overclocking. So almost done with the 4K standard benchmarks. This is a game, this Total War Warhammer 3, I definitely need to go back and retest everything, because I think newer drivers or a newer game patch has improved performance quite a bit. So don't pay too much attention to this right now. And then finally, we've got Watch Dogs Legion. This one I don't think has changed performance, and that's good. So you can see, the 4080 right in that 20%-ish range faster than the 3090 Ti. And if you're looking at the 3080, overall, again, the 4080 was about 56% faster than the 3080. So it's 56% faster, 71% more money. Like, that's not great gen-on-gen gains. If it had been 10%, 20% more money and 50% faster, I would have been way happier. All right, ray tracing. So because these cards are now getting so fast, I'm sorry if you hear my dog barking. He's excited. The kids are home, I think. Anyway, ray tracing pushes the GPU pretty much as hard as you can. And so we see like some, DLSS becomes more beneficial. The 4090 is still about, let's see, what did I say? In standard not ray tracing, the 4080 was 22% slower, and with ray tracing, it's 30% slower. Or if you want to flip that around, the 4090 with ray tracing is 43% faster than a 4080. That's a sizable gap. I mean, like the 3090 Ti, if you want to look at the 3090 Ti versus the 3080, that was a 36% gap, and that only happened after like a year and a half after the 3080 launched. And right at the start, we've got a 43% gap between the 4090 and 4080. So, you know, Nvidia went big. You know, they went really big on the RTX 4090, quite a bit less big on the 4080. Bright Memory Infinite benchmark, super demanding. I don't think the game is nearly as demanding, and the game doesn't look as good. But it does have a lot of ray tracing effects, and so I do like that. It shows what a next generation game might actually, how it might actually behave. And you can see, you know, we're looking at 40% difference between the 4090 and 4080. And you also got like the, I don't know, I think it's probably because of memory bandwidth. You know, even though the 4080 should be relatively, you know, compute-wise, it's like 20% or more faster. It's got newer technologies, should have better ray tracing hardware. But the 3090 Ti has that 384-bit bus, and the 4080 doesn't. Big L2 caches make up for some of that, but not all of it. Control, one of the few games that like justifies ray tracing game existence in my mind. There's more coming out like that. They look nice. Some of the games like Cyberpunk as well, we'll get to next. But Control was one of the first games where I was like, yep, I want to play that with ray tracing. It looks better. So, yeah. And you can see at 4K, maxed out ray tracing settings, all of the cards kind of struggle to hit 60 frames per second, except for the 4090. DLSS helps a lot. AMD's cards down near the bottom, you know, their ray tracing hardware isn't in the same league as Nvidia's Ampere, never mind Ada. And we see that again with Cyberpunk. This one, AMD has released preliminary benchmarks for the 7900 XTX, and it showed it sitting, I think it was like 24.7 or 25 frames per second. So like right at the level of the 3090 Ti is AMD's high mark on ray tracing and Cyberpunk performance. So that gives you something to think about. Is ray tracing the future? I think it is. I don't know how long until we get to a future where it becomes actually required. It's still in that case where you can play Cyberpunk without ray tracing and you don't miss that much. You miss some reflections and some lighting that the lighting doesn't even always look that great in my mind. All right, Fortnite. Speaking of ray tracing, hey, let's take a competitive shooter that's designed for, you know, highest frame rates possible. I think without ray tracing, like even modest cards are getting like 150 to 200 frames per second at 4K and like high settings. And then we crank it up to epic, max out the ray tracing settings, and everything collapses into the teens or 20s. Or if you've got a 4080, you can get 38.2 frames per second. DLSS gives you 70 frames per second. So, you know, like DLSS and Fortnite with a 4080 makes it absolutely viable to play with maxed out settings, including ray tracing. If you have a 4090, you can get like 90 frames per second. So high refresh rate 4K monitor. It's possible now. Almost done with the initial gaming benchmarks. We're at Metro Exodus. I don't have a whole lot more to say about this. Even though the enhanced edition does require ray tracing hardware, to me it didn't feel like it's that big of a visual upgrade over the original release, but maybe I'm overlooking something. Performance. This one, performance tends to be a bit higher than some of the other ray tracing games. I don't know if that's because it's better optimized or if it's just less demanding. Also, AMD's cards do a little bit better than in some of the other games. One thing I do know is that Metro Exodus Enhanced tends to be one of the higher power draws in the suite of games that I've tested. Do I have that? No, I don't have the power figures immediately at hand. But So the 4090 has a 450 watt total board power rating, so it's supposed to stay under 450 watts without overclocking. 4080 drops that down to 320 watts. Worth noting is that in testing, it actually didn't come anywhere near 320 watts in, I don't think, any of the games. I think you actually had to overclock it to get it close to 320 watts. Yeah, so average power draw at 1080p Ultra across 13 games was 221 watts. At 1440p, that was 253 watts. At 4K, it was 289 watts. The most demanding games were ray tracing games, which were falling in the 300, 310 watt range. Cyberpunk was 292. Flight Simulator was 306. That's interesting because that wasn't that high on the 4090. And yeah, overclocked. The average power use was still only 311 watts. So you got 7% more performance and about 7% more power draw. Oh, I was going to say Metro Exodus power use was 308 watts. So it was right near the top of the power use for all of the games I tested. And it was still 305 watts at 1440p and 291 watts at 1080p. Whereas like games like Watch Dogs were only 170 watts at 1080p. Because it's CPU limited partially. Minecraft was also not super demanding on the power front. It used GPU load was also lower, even on the 4080. At 4K, it showed 83% GPU utilization, which is kind of odd. I would have thought with full path tracing that it would have been heavier, but maybe the shaders don't have to do as much work in Minecraft, and so it shows lower GPU utilization. Okay, that's all the 4K games. So 4K gaming performance, again, to summarize, it was 30% slower than the 4090, but also 48% faster than the 3080 Ti. So, 50% gain gen over gen is decent. And then compared to the 3080, it was 72% faster in our ray tracing suite. But if you look at the not ray tracing suite, then things became less impressive, where it was 50% faster than the 3080. Oh, that's the wrong card. 3080 Ti. It was 38% faster, and then it was 22% slower than the 4090. So price performance wise, it's not all that different from the 4090, but normally it's like as you go up the scale, you get to the top and the fastest cards are brutally expensive for 5 to 10% more performance. And that's not the case this time. It's like, yeah, the 4090, it is 33% more money, but it's also 30 to 40% more performance. Let's see, what do we got over on the chat? Anything I need to answer? Raise your hand. So he says he's got last week's worldwide channel sales trend. So he's saying it's in line with the Radeon 7. I'm not sure about that. I'll leave that for you, Mike. I'm looking at things and trying to parse what they mean. Clarification. Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I see the prices going up, and I'm like, I guess people, after 2 years of not being able to find graphics cards at MSRP, the fact that they're now at MSRP, people seem to be buying them, even though new stuff is here now. And the new stuff is overpriced, which pushes people to buy the old stuff. That's kind of my take. Roger Hole says 4080 for the performance shown and the substitute for the 3080 Ti. For the price and performance, it's greater than the 3080 Ti. The references are greater than the 3090 Ti. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely faster. It's not like you got less performance than a 3090 Ti, but it just wasn't as big of a gain as the 4090 was over the previous generation. All right, 1440p. I don't have all the individual game charts, but like if we go back to the first slide of performance data, so you can see here the 4090 is in our standard gaming suite. It's it's the 4080 is 22% slower, or if you prefer, the 4090 is 29% faster. At 1440p, it's only so here's the 4K results, right? At 1440p, let me try and find the right chart. Sorry. At 1440p, the difference is only 12% in favor of the 4090. And if you wanted to go to 1080p, ray tracing first, 1080p. The difference at 1080p is only 8%. So that's partly just because my system is becoming CPU bottlenecked, even with a 12900K. With ray tracing, because it's so demanding, the gap in performance still stays large. So like the 4090 at 4K was 43% faster. At 1440p, it's still 34% faster. It's still 26% faster at 1080p. I mean, it's shrinking, but it doesn't go down to zero quite as quickly as non-ray tracing. And if I had a theoretically twice as fast CPU, I'm sure those gaps would widen back up. We already talked about 1080p ray tracing. And I think that does it for the ray tracing, or for the standard gaming performance. So, DLSS 3. Let's talk DLSS 3 for a moment. There's a lot to say in this show. I've got so much data. Too much data. In fact, this chart gets to be a bit of a mess. So I've only tested the 40 series cards. We've got DLSS 3, DLSS 2, and native. And then each of those can be run with frame generation. So quality mode, performance mode, and native with frame generation. So without frame generation is DLSS 2, and with frame generation is DLSS 3, except that you can also do native with frame generation, and you can see like how things land. So all the green bars are with frame generation, the light blue bars are DLSS, and then we've got the native bars at the bottom. And, Plague Tale Requiem, already running at 57 frames per second on the 480, so it doesn't need a lot of help to get way up into the high frame rates. You could do native with frame generation and forget about upscaling and get 88 frames per second. Or you could do DLSS 2 quality mode without frame generation and get 84 frames per second. We'll get to the latency in a bit, but frame generation does have worse latency, so I think in general I would take DLSS 2 quality mode over frame generation. Cyberpunk, very demanding game, so the gains are larger here. You can see at native we're at 27 frames per second with psycho lighting, 39 frames per second on the 4090. The 4080 with DLSS 3 performance mode gets up to 109 frames per second. Yay! I find the artifacts are definitely visible though, so I would drop down to like DLSS 3 quality mode, and then you're at 79 frames per second. And I think like maybe there's artifacts. I don't generally see them. You have to pixel peep to find them. I know people have shown stuff where like the frame generation broke down, but I generally don't see it when I was playing through Cyberpunk. That's the game I spent the most time with on frame generation. F1 2022, frame rates were already pretty decent before, so it is, getting up to 230 frames per second instead of 96 frames per second. You more than double your performance. But you're also, like Nvidia shows, they're like, yeah, we render 1/8 of the pixels. So we render an eighth, we upscale it 4x, and then we frame generate. And it's like, yeah, that should boost performance a lot, and it does. Again, you could do native without upscaling and get over 100 frames per second with both of the cards. And that might be maybe the best quality version, whereas DLSS 2 quality gets you more performance in this case without the input lag that frame generation creates. Flight Simulator was kind of the best case scenario because it was so CPU bottlenecked, and so you doubled your frame rates with DLSS 3, and like, I guess I didn't do DLSS 3 performance mode on the 4090, but on the 4080, you know, you got 125 versus 150 with performance versus quality upscaling. Flight Simulator being what it is, I think 120 frames per second should be more than adequate. Lyra, Unreal Engine 5 Lyra. It's not a great looking game demo. Like, it's kind of like a throwback to Unreal Tournament if you haven't seen it. And I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe it's doing some complex stuff, but the level is pretty simple and the graphics don't wow me, so I've included it just because it was a test I could run, but I don't really like, I want a better Unreal Engine 5 demo than Lyra. Davina asks, is the price what most people are complaining about? Yes. It's very much the price, because the 3080 was a $699 part, and now the 4080 is a $1199 part. So 71% higher price. And feature tests. 3D Mark, you know, it's not a game. The charts, you know, if you look at the two charts here, their relative scale is not that different. So DLSS feature test does kind of show some data. And then let's see, we've got Cyberpunk latency testing. So this is important. Oh, I have these out of order. I want to go native first. So native resolution, and I tested on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cards. And you can see the 4090 running native has a latency of 52 milliseconds. Turn on frame generation and the latency increased by basically a frame. And then, actually that's more than a frame, because I don't remember what the frame rate is off the top of my head, but it's probably like a frame and a half of latency, because it's like 15 milliseconds longer. 4080 is at 70 milliseconds. Turning on frame gen gets it up to 81 milliseconds. And you can see, because frame rates and latency are linked, Titan RTX was running really slow. 1080, the 3080 10 gigabyte was running really slow, so those are hundreds of milliseconds of latency. Not really playable. Then you turn on quality upscaling, and latencies drop quite a bit on all of the cards. But you can see, like, DLSS 2 still beats DLSS 3 for latency, and it pretty much always should. But you have to decide, do you want the smoother feel of more frames being generated, or do you want the faster response times? And then finally, performance upscaling. Like, I don't think you need frame generation so much once you're at performance mode. At least not on the 4090 and 4080. Maybe when we've got 4070 and 4060 performance mode in DLSS plus frame generation will start to make more sense. This is let's see. I'm wondering if the benchmarks, Davina asks, of the 4080 indicate how mobile GPUs will perform. Somewhat. I mean, you know, they're not going to stick a 320 watt part into a laptop, but as I showed with the 4090, you can drop the power use by 30% and only lose about 10% of your performance. I would assume that's going to be similar on the 4080 and 4070 and so on down. The previous generation, a mobile RTX 3080 Ti is really just a desktop 3070, if I remember right. Like, I don't think they use GA102 in any of their mobile parts. And so, you know, potentially we won't see 40 series mobile that uses 8102 or 8103 is kind of how I feel. I think the mobile parts will probably start at the 8104, which is what was in the unlaunched RTX 4080 12GB. That is apparently now the RTX 4070 Ti is what it's rumored to be coming as. All right. I also wanted to look. This is just raw, as close as I come to doing pure ray tracing in a game. So there's a 3D Mark DirectX ray tracing feature test. I max out the number of rays and then measure the frame rates. And you can see, like, if you're trying to find pure ray tracing performance, AMD's fastest is below the first generation Titan RTX, which was only a little bit faster than a 2080 Ti. AMD says they're going to get about 80% more ray tracing performance with RDNA 3. We'll see how they actually fare in real world testing next month. But I think if you hope for ray tracing to become a bigger thing, you'll probably end up still wanting an Nvidia card. Professional stuff. Okay, we're done with the games. Gaming questions. I'm going to turn off my charts for a second. And Davina's here. Yes, she is. You know, it wasn't fake, though. If cryptocurrency and COVID hadn't happened, it would have been a $700 card. That's what Nvidia made it to be. $700 to $800. The partners would have charged $800, maybe at the most $850. Liquid cooled $900. Like, that's what happened with the previous generation cards. And then the poop hit the fan and shortages everywhere, supply constraints, and everything went crazy. And so, you know, you can't just look at the last 2 years and think that's the real pricing of things, because it's all messed up. The real pricing would have been the patterns that we established over 20 years. So I think the 3080 makes money selling at $700. It makes Nvidia and the partners and the distributors and the retailers money. But when Nvidia raises the price and then the distributor raises the price, or the AIB partner raises the price, you know, suddenly it ends up at $1,200 at retail because everyone wants a bigger slice of the pie. Were my charts too ugly? I'm sorry, Stefan. They're in my article on Tom's Hardware, so if you want to stare at them a bit longer, go ahead. Or he's out. All right. And let's go to professional stuff. So this is Spec ViewPerf. AMD made a big statement about optimizing their OpenGL drivers, which helps with professional applications like Spec ViewPerf. And this is the overall geometric mean, which gives equal weighting to everything. But in professional applications, maybe that's not the most meaningful thing. But overall, AMD now comes out on top. I mean, even the 6800 XT beats all of the consumer parts of the current and previous generation AMD stuff. If you have the Nvidia formerly known as Quadro, so like the RTX A6000, those have drivers that enable a bunch of stuff that they don't enable in their studio drivers, and their performance in Spec ViewPerf, I believe, can be something like 5 times faster. It's a big jump in some of the applications. It's not all of them, but some of them get a huge boost. 3D Studio Max, this is one of the ones I think that doesn't need professional drivers so much. Like, you get good performance out of the box with the consumer parts. That applies to a lot of ray tracing stuff. CATIA benefits more from drivers. Creo, again, like, if you look at the Titan RTX in these charts, where the Titan ranks high is ones where drivers will help NVIDIA's professional cards more, and where it ranks low means the consumer parts are pretty close. So let's see, let's go on. Creo, and I don't even know what most of these are. I know what 3D Studio Max is, but I don't use Creo or CATIA. Like, that's just not my my thing. So if you use those programs, great. Maya, another rendering, 3D rendering application. And then, is this the one? No, medical. So AMD does well in medical. They do well in CATIA, I believe. And then here's the, no, energy. This is the big one, I think. Yes, SNX. This is the one where drivers matter the most. Siemens NX. And you can see that the Titan RTX, so that's a 2-generation old card now. Because it had the driver optimizations, it got a huge boost. AMD provides that for free-ish to their consumer users. Nvidia locks it behind their professional cards, and so all of the RTX 40 series, 30 series, 20 series, they perform really poorly in this particular workload. And the solution is, you would, if you really want this to run fast with an Nvidia card, you either need a Titan, which they haven't made in 2 years because it was cannibalizing workstation sales, or you need the RTX 6000 or A6000 or whatever the various models are called these days. SolidWorks, and I think that's it. Next up we have ray tracing applications. So V-Ray only supports NVIDIA GPUs or CPUs. So you can run V-Ray on AMD cards, but it doesn't use the cards, it just uses your CPU. So that's why these are all NVIDIA cards. Pretty big gains, you know, if you look at gen over gen, like we're talking about 3968 compared to 2346, you know, 70% higher performance in pure ray tracing hardware, looking at the 3080 and 4080. The 3968, the 4080 is also, you know, 35% faster than the 3090 Ti, and then of course conversely the 4090 is still, oops, I'm doing this on the fly, last 3968, it's 5430, it's like 45% faster. I can't type right now. 35% faster. Do I have that right? Yeah. So decent gains if you go for the top model. And if you're doing this professionally, paying 33% more for 35% more performance would be the way to go. CUDA versus RTX, I mean, I don't know that that matters much. Octane Bench is for OTOY's Octane 3D rendering application. They used to support OpenCL. They dropped it with the later versions because they felt like OpenCL wasn't doing enough. Like it just wasn't actively developed, and so it had bugs and problems, and they got tired of it. I asked them, I'm like, hey, why doesn't this work on AMD GPUs? And that was the response. They're investigating getting it working on AMD's, I can't remember what they have some engine that's like NVIDIA's optics, but it's AMD's variant of that, and they're working on getting that up and running again. It's not yet ready yet. Again, 40% roughly faster for the 4090 over the 4080, 38%. So big big gains between the top two cards. And then these are just a bunch of other, like the scales are almost all the same on these other Octane Bench results, so I'm not going to spend any time on those. And then finally we get Blender, which does support AMD GPUs. It even supports Intel GPUs for 3D rendering. And I don't know like why exactly it's so slow. Is it their hardware, or is it the software doesn't take full advantage of the hardware? Maybe a little of both, a little of column A, a little of column B. This is why certain professional markets like 3D rendering are going after NVIDIA cards more than AMD, because NVIDIA pushed ray tracing first and they offer much better performance. The other Blender benchmarks, I'm not going to spend much time on them, and I think that does the professional stuff, and we've got just one more area to discuss, and that's power. So I talked power earlier. You can see this is kind of the worst case scenario. This was as high as I could get reasonably get power draw. I guess I didn't use ray tracing in Metro Exodus, so I probably could have got another 10 to 15 watts out of it with ray tracing. But using the same game across all of the cards, you can see, you know, the 4090 and the 3090 Ti both come in a little bit below their 450 rated power draw, but the 4090 is substantially faster. So, you know, Ada is a lot more efficient if you look at it that way. 4080 drew less power than any of the other cards in this particular benchmark and provided better performance than any of the cards except for the 4090. So performance per watt went up a lot. We got the line charts. If you really want to look at these charts, I would recommend going to our article. Core clocks. Check that out. 3.039 gigahertz with the manual overclock. And without the manual overclock, even at stock, it was running 2.78 gigahertz. So, you know, Nvidia definitely designed Ada like AMD did with their previous RDNA 2 and now RDNA 3. They re-architected things to hit much higher clocks, and it shows, and it boosts performance a lot. In-game clocks, they kind of flatline at just over 3 gigahertz. And then we got temperatures. So I mentioned how this gigantic thing cools really well, and that's what we see here. Like, temperatures and fan speeds are related, which is why the overclock, I run the fan at a higher speed, and that's why the temperature was lower. All the rest are running stock, and the 4080 was the coolest running card out of all these basically reference cards, except for the Sapphire 6950 XT and the 3090 Ti from Asus. So then related to, okay, we got to go line chart, and then we've got the fan speeds. You know, you can see I increased the fan speed by like 50% roughly with overclocking, but at stock it was only running 1283. 3090 actually ran its fan even slower. So they went after lower noise rather than lower temperatures. And I do have some noise charts, but I don't think they're next. This is just the fan speed chart. We've got the same thing for Furmark, 330 watts overclocked, 303 watts at stock. Again, that's pretty good for a supposedly 320 watt card. So the 4090, you can see, exceeded its 450 watts by 10 watts, whereas the 4080 came in almost 20 watts below its rated power draw. But that's not just... It's not just power draw, because if you look at clock speeds, you'll see that the 4080 did downclock to 2.3 gigahertz, whereas the 4090 ran at still close to 2.5. Overclocking increases that. Temperatures, still fine. And then fan speeds related to temperatures, also still fine. And last slides. Noise levels. So this is my SPL meter. If you want to see what that looks like, it's like a microphone. I stick this 10 centimeters away so that it's not picking up a bunch of extra noise. The room is as quiet as I can get it, which the SPL meter bottoms out at around 32 decibels. And so, you know, 10 centimeters away, putting your ear right next to it, this is how loud it would be. The 6900 XT and above are very quiet. Like, I wouldn't say they're silent, but they're not loud at all. As you get to the bottom of the chart, like the 3080 Ti was very audible. That's the Founders Edition, which the problem with the 3080 Ti Founders Edition was it had the same cooler as the 3080, but higher power limit and more memory, so it ran loud. It wasn't, I don't know, it wasn't loud, but it wasn't at all a silent card. And then I also tested at 75% fan speeds. This isn't like as useful, but this was just kind of showing how much headroom there is for the card to cool better. So like the fan speed percentages for the 4080 at stock while running games. Here, I'll look at my paper. So it ran the fan at 38%. So, you know, if you need it to cool better, you could crank the fan speed way up, and it does get very loud. I mean, at 100%, all the fans are probably going to be like 70 decibels at the close range that I measure at. But you know, the Asus card up at the top of the 75% thing, that just tells you that it doesn't have the capability to get cooler if you need to crank up the fan speed. All right, that's it. Questions? That was a lot of rambling. We're over time. We're over an hour. Jensen's claims were not at all hyperbole at the launch. I think they were. I mean, I feel like you need DLSS 3 to get the claims that they were making. When they're like, hey, you know, the RTX 4090 is up to 4 times faster than the 3090 Ti. I'm like, no. That's in a very specific scenario. And I don't think it represents what most people end up doing. They would like it if every game supported DLSS 3 and people used it to test. I mean, Nvidia would love for me to test only with DLSS enabled in games that support it, because it would make their performance numbers look really good. You could do it. You could test with FSR2 enable and everything that supports that as well. But, you know, at some point I like to just level the playing field and test everything at native, and that tells you what the underlying hardware does, and then software tricks, AI tricks like DLSS, they come into play, and they may or may not help. Yeah, performance per watt was good. Yes. And you could probably further limit your power draw. I mean, you know, at 1080p it was using less than 200 watts because I was CPU limited, but you could probably, if you play at 1080p, you could probably run it as a 200 watt card and still get great performance. And yeah. Yeah, this is the problem. It's not a bad card. Like I really like the design. Like I think Nvidia's chunky. If you've got a big case, I like big cases. If you've got a big case and you can fit a triple slot card in, and it's got the triple slot bracket, so it's more stable. I think the card design is good. If you like small cases, yeah, it's going to be a problem. So it's not about the performance or the features or any of that. It's more about the pricing. I don't think Nvidia needs to charge as much as they do. I don't think their bill of materials is anywhere near requiring a $1,200 price point. That's just, they're doing it to make money because they can. They're the bigger company. The fact that AMD has a chip that would be more expensive to make, meaning MCD plus GCDs, or GCD plus MCDs, sorry, there's multiple MCDs. All those chips combined from TSMC for the Navi 31, they got to cost more than the 4080 does. So everything about the 7900 XTX to me says that's a more expensive card to make from the hardware standpoint. And yet AMD says we can sell it at $999 or $899 for the slightly toned down version, and they're okay with that. I don't think they're losing money at all at those prices. I think they're still making several $100s per card, or the chain is, the whole industry. So, you know, your AAB partner, your distributors, and your retailers all make their slice of the pie. But Nvidia just wants a bigger slice of the pie. And by pricing this at $1,200, I mean, I don't know what they charge their AIB partners, but when they say the MSRP is $1,200, that usually means that what they charge their partners scaled up with that as well. And so when we had the cryptocurrency craziness and Nvidia said, hey, the 3080 is a $700 card, and the street prices were $1,500 and more, most of that money didn't go to AMD. It went to the add-in board partners, it went to the distributors, it went to the retailers. Raising the price like this, Nvidia takes that slice at the front. So it's kind of annoying. I don't know if they really needed to, if they priced it lower though, would it have just resulted in the same shenanigans we're seeing with the 4090? Probably, maybe. Like, I still think if you want an extreme graphics card, you go for the 4090. You don't save $400 to get a 4080. If $1,200 is too much, if $1,600 is too much, $1,200 is too much, maybe $800 is too much. Like, a lot of people want a good $400 graphics card, and so it doesn't matter what the $800 and the $1,200 cards cost or can do. They just want a good $400 card. We should get those next year. Like, I think we'll see a Radeon 7700 class card for around that $400 to $500 price point. That should be faster than a 6950. We'll probably get a 4070 Ti that, with DLSS 3, will beat a 3090 Ti and cost hopefully $600. I hope when they canceled the 4080 12GB that the 4070 Ti inherits the old 3070 Ti price point of $600. It doesn't look like it will, though, based on the other card pricing. We'll see. I think that's about it, guys. Thanks for watching. It's been an hour and 15 minutes, and it's time for me to get back to testing. I won't have any 4080 partner card reviews up tomorrow because I killed myself getting this card's review done, and so I'll need a few days to test. I've got a couple of cards that I've received and a couple more on their way. So check on Tom's Hardware. We'll have the full reviews up in the coming days, and we will see you next week. I'm going to take off Thursday and Friday this week. Take care.